Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. We welcome Senator Amy Klobuchar and Preet Bharara to our series. We invite you to visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel for over 300 conversations. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Our handle is Live Talks LA. Senator Klobuchar's book is Antitrust, Taking on Monopoly Power from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age. Senator Klobuchar is a senior senator from Minnesota, the first woman from the state to be elected to the U.S. Senate. She is the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights. Preet served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 2009 to 2017. He's host of the podcast Stay Tuned with Preet, a podcast focused on issues of justice and fairness. He's the author of Doing Justice, A Prosecutor's Thoughts on Crime, Punishment, and the Rule of Law. I am Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of the series. Welcome to all of you. They will talk, and towards the end, I will pose some questions that came from you in the audience. Take it from here, Preet.
Senator, welcome. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Preet. It's great to be on with you and do LA Live Talks. So thank you.
In ordinary times, we'd be in LA, which would be better than my basement in Westchester County. So congratulations on the book. This is a very substantial book. There's research, there's history. Did you not get the memo that elected officials' books are supposed to be thin memoirs with sloganeering in them? Did you not?
With beautiful pictures of yourself as a politician, yes.
And your family. And how we can all pull together. Did you not get that memo?
Well, I did get it once a few years ago.
So you did that.
I decided it was time to take on this really, really major issue for our economy that Washington has just sat on for years. It's like whack-a-mole. Every time you try to do something, someone is trying to protect some monopoly. And this is through history, actually. But the difference between now and history is they did take things on. AT&T, the whole breakup of AT&T, the Ida Tarbell, the muckraker, taking on Standard Oil. And so I really wanted to bring this to life because it's all stuck right now, as you know, in court cases and legalese. So that's why I included over 100 cartoons, including some really funny.
A lot of cartoons. That's one of my favorite parts. For me, being a slow reader, that's one of my favorite parts of the book. I
like the cartoon where the guy's trying to Google the word antitrust and his computer starts exploding because he was on Google. The other piece of it is trying to find some antitrust humor. I use the story of John Oliver's half-an-hour show devoted to antitrust and monopolies, in which he ends by saying, if all of this, the consolidation in the cat food market, in pharma, in tech, in the online travel, if this is enough to make you want to die, good luck, because there's only 3 casket makers. And then he puts the names on that. Now, here's the sad part, Preet. One bought the other. So there's only 2 casket makers.
Yes. Look, so you maybe obviated the need for me to ask you this question, quoting from your book, because right away you made clear to folks why they should care about this. But I want to ask you to amplify. You say early on in the book, quote, when people ask me as a senator what monopolies and antitrust policy have to do with their lives, the answer I give now is the same one I gave back then as I raked in the monopoly money rent on my railroads. Everything. The answer is everything. Antitrust and monopolies have everything to do with our economy, the prices we pay, and the way we live. Outside of caskets and cat food, what else for viewers and listeners is affected by this very important issue?
Yep. Well, I'd say the big one right now that everyone's focused on, and I don't want to exclude the rest of the economy when you look at this, is tech. So if you're thinking, how come they don't have better privacy regulations? Well, government should be doing that. And I hope we do that very soon. But think about the fact that a lot of times in capitalism, bells and whistles get developed by a competitor. So maybe Instagram or WhatsApp would have developed a great privacy policy or done better with misinformation. We are never going to know because they were bought out by Facebook. Or maybe Waze would have done something different than Google Maps, but then Google Maps bought out ways. And so you have a situation where really, in the words of Mark Zuckerberg's email that my friend David Cicilline discovered when he was doing his great series of hearings and House report, where Zuckerberg, to paraphrase, said, these may be small companies, they're nascent, those were his words, competitors, but their brands could be disruptive to us. So, I thought tech and competition by its nature are supposed to disrupt things. And so when you have no disruption and when monopolies start taking over, they do things like, just roll over newspapers and news content providers because they can. And then you start seeing newspapers close down. So that affects people. Yeah. Pharma prices, EpiPen, insulin, that affects people in their everyday lives when monopolies overprice things. Newborn babies, I tell the story from a case in Minnesota of what happened to them. Prices go up $108 to $1,500 for a drug treatment for heart defects for newborn babies because one company buys both drugs. It literally goes through our entire economy.
What's so strange about it when you talk about tech is, it's something you said a second ago struck me, that tech is supposed to be about disruption. And for some of these companies, it was. Amazon was a disruptor. Facebook was a disruptor. Twitter, Google. And in fairly short order, I mean, these guys haven't been around for 100 years. In fairly short order, they went from something that I'm guessing you and your colleagues would have applauded.
Did applaud,
right? And they went from not being profitable, and a lot of people wondering, are they even going to succeed and survive? To not that long a time later, they're being excoriated in the halls of the Senate. Mm-hmm. Is that inevitable for any successful company that begins as a disruptor or not?
I don't think so, because you have areas of our economy where there is competition, and you don't see that as much. But when you look through history, this story has been told before. So of course, when AT&T, then called Ma Bell, started, everyone's like, oh my God, we have a telephone. Might have been this huge thing with the cord, but we have a telephone. This is so great. And that went on for decades and decades. And then pretty soon they controlled everything under them. That would be called a vertical monopoly because they controlled the machinery. And then they controlled everything on its sides, all those local exchange companies. That's called horizontal dominance. So you had a vertical and a horizontal monopoly. So pretty soon the government starts saying, wait a minute, we don't have any competition. Long distance rates are too high. There's a cell phone market, but they kind of control that too. So then they broke them up. So that's my point. The chairman of AT&T then says later, we're actually a stronger company because we are forced to compete. So the point I have here is it's great that these companies have been successful. They've given us incredible innovations. They employ a ton of people in America. We're not talking about getting rid of them. Come on. We're talking about looking at this through the lens of competition policy and looking at history and saying our laws are on the books as a check. Our laws are on the books because this is inevitable in a capitalist system. Adam Smith, the godfather of American capitalism, he said, he loves this invisible hand, all that stuff. But he said, beware, over and over, he said this about this unbridled power of the army of monopolies. Okay, so what do? You have to use the laws on the books, and I would say improve them as we have over time, so that you have a check on these monopolies. And you don't get rid of them. No, you just maybe break them up so you can have Instagram or WhatsApp starting to compete with them. You do things like put privacy rules in place. You say to the app stores, seriously, you guys have become the web, Google and Apple. You're going to charge 30% to Match.com and Spotify, a direct competitor of yours? No, you're going to not even allow consumers to be told they could get cheaper rates on their websites. So there's just all kinds of things that you can do, but we have to get the political will to do it, which is why I wrote the book.
Why you wrote the book and a law, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. Did you demote Adam Smith from father to godfather? Is that a promotion? I can't. Is that a
Throwing
promotion?
it out. Okay, you're right.
Father of capitalism. I'm not sure.
I don't know, they both work. Well, I guess I'm thinking God.
Capo of capitalism.
You know why? Because after our app hearing, where I found out that Google tried to intimidate Match.com the night before the hearing, I'm thinking the Godfather series of movies.
I thought
That's why it's on my mind.
Can you? So you've raised a number of issues and problems that affect the economy, affect competition, affect individuals. And maybe this is an unfair question, but I wonder if you could rank the issues, and among them are privacy problems, media consolidation, so you don't get more points of view, price gouging in pharma and in other places, issues that arise from too big to fail.
Sure.
Is there one that's more important than all the others and should be focused on? Or do you believe, as I imagine you'll say, you have to take a global approach?
Yes. Well, I look at it as consumers, and everything you just talked about affects consumers and citizens and people, just hardworking people trying to get by. You're not supposed to charge those people a whole bunch of money for EpiPens. You're not supposed to be able to have the monopoly power to push them around on the price of insulin. You're not allowed to lie to them about, oh, you've got all these choices for online travel when two companies control 90% of the market. So I just put the consumers, the people of this country, in the middle, and then from there flows the priorities. I would say the most pressing one right now is to something near and dear to your heart with your previous job, DOJ, the Department of Justice. Get people in place there that can do this job. And then also make sure that DOJ, antitrust, and the FTC isn't using duct tapes and Band-Aids to take on the world's biggest companies we have ever known, trillion-dollar companies. And they are a shadow of their former selves in terms of number of lawyers, et cetera, even from the Reagan administration. So how do we expect this?
Where enforcement was low already.
Right. And I am actually glad that during the Trump administration, at the end, Macon Delrahim over at DOJ Antitrust, I didn't agree with everything he did, but he did bring that suit against Google. And the FTC under Chairman Simon brought a major case against Facebook with the attorney generals in this case. After the election, he did it from around the country. I like it because it goes from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration. And that's actually what's happened in the past with these successful litigated matters. So first thing is get the money to the agencies. Grassley and I have a bipartisan bill to change the fee structure, which hasn't been changed since Hart-Scott-Rodino passed on the mega mergers, and that will bring more money to agencies. And then in the appropriations process, they will need more funding. You just can't pretend you're doing this and talk the talk without making those changes. Secondly, exclusionary conduct, looking back at, as I just mentioned, what you need to do about the current state of affairs, making that easier to do it. And then the third is mergers going forward, and that is changing the burden. So these big mergers, 5 billion and over, or where they are a major monopoly, and then they purchase a small guy, making them have the burden to show that it doesn't hurt competition.
One of the things I love about the book that we've already mentioned is how much history there is. And we'll talk about some of the, I think it's useful for people to understand the ebb and flow of people's concerns about monopoly and competition. But one of my favorite bits is I learned a bit about the game and the woman who invented the game. And I think this is true. You didn't say it explicitly, but my favorite piece on the Monopoly board when I was a kid was the thimble. I think yours was too. So
exactly.
We're obviously soulmates, both on policy and on Monopoly. But my question is, growing up, is there some kind of brain indoctrination among people in this country who play Monopoly? and from an early age, Monopoly is good. Monopoly is great. It was your favorite game. It was one of my favorite games. Is there something to that? Should we stop? Should we call it something else as it was called initially?
I'm not going to change the name of the game, but I think one of the fascinating stories in the book, which is built on the research of incredible reporters, Mary Pallone from and others from Wall Street Journal, New York Times, people have written. So I kind of consolidated all of it. And in fact, there was a woman named Lizzie McGee, who was a socialist, basically, and a fan of Georgianism from the time.
And she made Monopoly?
She made Monopoly. She was the inventor. It's like literally you see the board and you know the game. She did it to go after monopolies. The whole thing was showing how bad it was to have monopolies. Then what happens is this gambler guy starts doing sort of copying her thing, and then the game maker Parker Brothers comes in, and they actually give him a whole ton of money. He becomes rich, and they gave her a check for like $500, and with the promise they'd put out her socialist version the next year or 2 years later, which of course went nowhere.
How'd that do? No.
Right, exactly. So then Monopoly became the game that it was. And we, as you said, I grew up thinking, I just beat my grandma by buying out all the railroads and and getting that Park Place and those places. And we played it in that way, that capitalism, successful capitalism, was all about just buying stuff out. And that's fine. That does true. People do sometimes better when they go bigger. I'm not quarreling with that, but there were no antitrust cards in that little chance card pile, right? And so I think the point of this is not to go after the game, but to step back and realize that we need to look at competition policy in terms of what our country was really built on, the concerns that the founding fathers had. Go even before that, so many people came to our country because they wanted religious freedom, political freedom, but they also wanted economic freedom. They were a bunch of mavericks. They didn't want to have to buy tea from the East India Tea Company. That was part of the Tea Party. And then you move forward, and as the Gilded Age developed, and it took 100 years for Congress to finally do something, you started to have these angry farmers with pitchforks and people organizing on the streets of Chicago, union movement, because of monopolies, whether they be rail or the Pullman monopoly or some of the ag monopolies, you just name it. And they then organized, and it got to the point where state governors, legislatures, and finally Washington had to act. And I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing, and it doesn't feel the same because no one's having pitchforks, but I think that's what you're seeing with tech. And we need to seize this moment. I was in the private sector for 14 years. I think it's great we have successful companies. I just want to have more successful companies. I don't want them all bought up by a bunch of gatekeepers, and they make it hard for anyone to achieve any level of competition with them. I think what we have right now is dangerous. Just look at the misinformation online. Just look at the fact that we've got privacy violations and problems up the wazoo. I just think it's time to finally enforce our antitrust laws and make them as sophisticated as our current economy.
So you mentioned the founders, and you have passages in the book, as you mentioned just now, describing, the impulse and the spirit of the founders in terms of not just democracy, but also, freedom, economic freedom. And yet the Constitution itself, as you also point out, doesn't have much to say about this. I'm not asking you to second guess the framers too much, but was that a mistake? Should there have been something in the actual nation's charter on this?
Well, they make little references. They have reference about protecting intellectual property. They have reference about basically not having to pay out, of course, to England and some of the bad practices that were going on there from the British government. So that's in there. But what they don't do is specifically mention monopolies. And there's really interesting exchanges that I have between various founding fathers like Jefferson and Madison about this. And they basically conclude, you know what? It's going to be okay. I think it was Madison saying it's going to be okay because the people will stand up. That's why we're setting up this government. They'll do something about it when it's necessary. Well, he was right. It just took 100 years. And finally, his words were rewarded because the Sherman Act finally passes with a Republican senator from Ohio because of this movement that I just talked about. So I go through all that to give people some hope that throughout time, the Clayton Act, the government taking on, as I mentioned, AT&T or Microsoft, and some of the past actions, Standard Oil with journalists called muckrakers back then, a woman named Ida Tarbell writing this volumes of work about Standard Oil, it resulted in that breakup. So this has happened in the past. We're just not doing anything right now, and it's time to act.
I've noticed a couple of times in our conversation, you have said forcefully, look, I think big business is great. I think people, should be able to make money. I was in the private sector for 14 years. Do you find it necessary to always emphasize that, because people misunderstand what antitrust reform is about when you talk about it, or when your colleague?
Mhm.
It's just striking to me.
Yeah. Well,
that you keep having to say, "Hey, listen, I'm not crazy. I believe in capitalism. I believe in all this stuff. I'm just saying X, this limited thing."
Well, really two reasons. One, because it's true. I do believe in capitalism. I just think you need checks and balances. And if you notice, I do that. Part of it is because I need to build the support for this. And I get pushback all the time from some Democrats, although I'll note, like, Mark Warner is on my big bill right now, the sweeping reform, as well as, of course, Blumenthal, Cory Booker. I got a whole bunch of bipartisan bills taking on tech when it comes to newspapers. I've got, the funding bill with Grassley. I think it's important to talk about this in a way that isn't just completely partisan, but at its core, to make clear, competition policy is about giving consumers, as I've noted, a chance at good prices, and they get sucked in sometimes. I do. Everyone does. Oh, this seems cheap. And then the next thing you know, what monopolies do is they start charging more later. The second thing is wages. If you only have one monopoly, they can they can decide to set the wages, or they can collude, if there's just a few of them, to set wages. There's been suits about this. Minorities, women-owned businesses, they can try to start, but if it's really hard to compete in an exclusionary environment as they try to grow, that's really tough to do. Immigration reform would be a great argument for competition, because you start bringing in the workers that we need. It's always easier for big business to bring in people than it is for small. I make the argument in this book that this goes beyond the antitrust laws, that competition policy, as they talk about it in other countries, includes a whole bunch of things. And we'd be much better off if we start thinking about things in that framework. We believe in a strong economy. Most of us believe in a capitalist system, but only if it has checks and balances, so it doesn't become a monopoly system, which is where we're headed right now.
So one of the checks and balances we have in our system of democracy is the courts. The courts are sometimes good, depending on the issue and the subject. The courts are sometimes not so good. So it's a very arresting story you tell at the beginning of the book that you already mentioned, the story of a company called Ovation, which bought up a drug from Merck that treats a rare heart valve problem in premature babies. So they buy that drug, then they buy another drug. The only two drugs that treat that issue, and 30-something thousand some odd folks, babies get it. They jack up the price, as you mentioned, and you describe it in a way, factually, that a reasonable person would think this is pretty terrible. What, as you mentioned, went from $108 a unit to $1,500 a unit, 44 times the price of what people in Canada pay for the same thing. It seems like a wonderful court case. It seems to be right in the tradition of existing antitrust laws. They're sued by the FTC. It goes to court, and then what happens?
What happens is a federal district court judge finds some market argument that they're not the same, which is literally ridiculous when you look at the fact that they're the only two drugs, and there's all kinds of evidence of emails and things saying from the companies, we can price them however we want. Well, yeah, because they own both of them. And then it goes up to the notoriously conservative Eighth Circuit, which has only gotten worse. And they throw it out, and the FTC, along with a bunch of attorney generals, including from some very red states, finally just decide this can only get worse. And the opinion, which says that allows this company to keep doing this, was, criticized by many, but it just shows what we're up against. And that is because of the Bork philosophy that came out of my alma mater, the University of Chicago.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Which basically looked at competition in this very strange way about what was in the consumer welfare, consumer goods, basically. And he argued that efficiency and that even protecting monopoly, even protecting big companies is in that. And it just put everything on its head. Out of that has come a number of conservative, not my case, just in general. Out of that has come a number of conservative court rulings that have completely backtracked from where the law was back in, say, the AT&T timeframe. And so what we've got now is even more conservative justices on the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh and Gorsuch both have made in the past incredibly conservative rulings against the tide when it comes to what's an okay merger or what's okay conduct. And so now they're on there ensconced on the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh did in one case side with the more liberal justices, but that's when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on there and it was about tech. But other than that, Gorsuch has gone full out Borkian. And so the concern is if you're going to wait for the courts to help on this, maybe in tech because of some of the differences with how tech, but we're never going to get there. And so that's my argument for changing the laws and doing something we've always done, which is make our laws fit the times. When the Clayton and Sherman Act passed, and some of the other bills that have passed through time, there wasn't even an internet, much less an Apple store. And so our situations now demand, I think, a more aggressive, sophisticated approach for the way the law works, although I don't think it's one bit radical. And then also maybe some individual things to happen immediately, such as laws governing the App Store, a new law, app stores, there's really only two, Google and Apple, or doing something about the newspapers and content. So there's many approaches and I'm open to all of them.
You talk about the Chicago School and you talk about Bork and you talk about conservatives / Republican. And I'm wondering how that happened. Because as you remind everyone in your book, the author of the Sherman Act, John Sherman, Republican, 1890. Now, I know the Republican Party was very different in the late 1800s, but then you also point out that Teddy Roosevelt, sort of was the tip of the spear on this kind of antitrust enforcement. And it's not clear to me why it should be the case that if you're conservative and you have the ideology of a conservative, you should be favorable to monopolists.
Exactly.
So I don't get that.
Well, and it's such a mess right now because, so everything you said is right. It's always was bipartisan. You had William Jennings Bryan, and then you had, Theodore Roosevelt, right? So it's because of the belief in capitalism that Republicans and Democrats were drawn to it, and also the consumers and the little guys and helping people in this country. But it all
small business. I thought they were on the side of small business.
Exactly, it's small business. So now here, what happens? So then the sort of during the Reagan-Bush time period, and even seeping into some of our Democratic presidents, they're like, okay, well, politically, this antitrust thing sounds real radical and the chamber doesn't like it. So we're going to just start adopting these philosophies, mostly Republicans. We're going to adopt these philosophies that will make it harder to enforce the antitrust laws. We're going to put judges on like that. We're going to not do changes to the laws. And there were some, the Republican Party was split even back during AT&T about whether they should settle it or not, or what they should do. You saw the Microsoft case getting settled kind of very easily for Microsoft at the very end. And so that keeps going. And then where we are now is it's gotten so out of hand, right, that you're starting to see some Republicans start pushing back. Ones that have been traditionally for small entrepreneurs and farmers, that'd be like a Grassley. And a little bit Daines did some work on this. There's a few others like that. Then you have the more conservative group, which is Cruz and Hawley, Blackburn, Lee, depending on the issue. Lee was great on this App Store one, that are pushing back. One for something I don't agree with at all. They're claiming, conservative content and they're trying to politicize it. But then sometimes their words are really similar to Republicans from the past that took this on. It's about entrepreneurs and small businesses. So, you basically take your support where you can find it. I know David Cicilline is having the same experience over in the House, but you do have a split in the Republican Party right now about how to handle this. And it's not like the split you see in other areas. I got to be honest, because you've got Democrats and Republicans who get too close, I think, to some of these businesses, tech, pharma, you name it. And so then they just kind of, oh, no, we can't do that. And so that's why I feel like I'm in a game of whack-a-mole all the time. Well, okay, we're going to get this Grassley-Klobuchar thing done. I almost had it done at the end of the year. I had the White House with me. Meadows was for it. I had Shelby was for it. Mitch had said, okay. Then we go over to the House and suddenly guess who says no? McCarthy and Jordan. So then every single time you try it, something happens. So that leads me to, I need strong support from the White House, which I think I'm going to have to move forward. We need strong people in the DOJ and in FTC, and Lena Khan was just nominated. I think that's a great thing. Tim Wu is over at the White House now. They get this stuff. And so that's what I need to move. And then I need to take it to the public, which is why I wrote the book and why I'm on LA Live Talk. I know LA cares about this, and California does. I know you've got tech up north, but I also know that is in California, people care a lot about content and about competition and about not limiting people's ability to compete. That's why everyone went to California in the first place. They were looking for a new frontier. So there you go.
So the other thing you talk about, when you explain and describe how ossified antitrust law is, there are some peculiarities and idiosyncrasies in antitrust law. And one of them is the area of exemptions. And there's one judge-created exemption that's kind of peculiar, and that's a blanket exemption for baseball. Yeah. No blanket exception for football, but there's a blanket exception for baseball, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court a number of times. Now, the reason I'm asking you is that's in the news lately.
Oh, yes, for very bad reasons. Yes.
So I wonder how you feel about it. So
right.
Some of your Republican colleagues want to now all of a sudden remove the baseball antitrust exemption because they're angry that baseball moved the All-Star game out of Georgia because of these terrible laws that are being passed in Georgia to suppress the vote, in my view. How do you think about the baseball exemption in light of the current climate?
Well, that is a horrible reason to make a change. And so that alone makes people pause. It's just kind of like, I had some issues with the AT&T merger that involved CNN. But the president issue with it, of course, was that he didn't like CNN. Right? You can't have that as a reason for making decisions. And that's exactly what they're doing with the baseball antitrust exemption, and why I wouldn't join them, because they're literally politicizing this as opposed to looking at things as a whole. I tell the story in my book about how that, about the football fight of one football player to try to make the argument that the NFL was a monopoly. And it's kind of a wild story how we got there. I also tell the story of Donald Trump himself and the defunct competitor to the NFL, the World Football League, and how he basically undermined it himself in a court case. It's a wild, wild story. I've found everything about Donald Trump's involvement with antitrust. But in the end, I think you wouldn't just go after one baseball. You'd have to look at this as a whole and figure it out with new policies and if there's exclusionary conduct. But I am just appalled by, my colleagues. It's so cynical because that's been our problem during the Trump era. Instead of just taking on antitrust, which Donald Trump was in a great position to do, and his people did, by the way, good work at the end, he decided to politicize every merger he didn't like. And that's exactly what they're trying to do with baseball. They're just blaming them because they didn't like what they did in Georgia. You cannot have competition policy run on the political whim of individuals.
Yeah, no, I'm into that. On enforcement, this is sort of weird. I've always found this weird, and I don't know if you want to answer the question and offend anyone in either of the agencies. But
you mean as the person that's willing to take on all the big tech companies, and it's going to happen to you the next day because of it? Yes. What?
No. Well, you'll appreciate what I mean. There are wonderful career professionals at the DOJ Antitrust Division
Mhm.
and at the FTC.
Yep.
And I've been in the Department of Justice. By the way, I, like you, in my first 2 years of practice after law school, did a lot of antitrust work. So we have that in common too, not just the thimble. We have that too. But for the life of me, and I don't think anybody's been able to explain this satisfactorily, why it is that sometimes the Antitrust Division of DOJ examines a merger and acquisition, and sometimes it's the FTC. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether or not those sort of lines of authority should be more clear, or there should be some kind of combination. Do you see what I did there? Combination of DOJ antitrust and the FTC. Is it inefficient for there to be two different agencies who occupy
right
the same
now,
space?
exactly. So I think you can coordinate better in terms of, and by the way, they did that, right, with the Google Facebook. FTC took the Facebook suit and DOJ took the Google suit. They did that even with Chairman Simon and with Macon Delrahim over in the Trump administration. They have to when they're taking on the world's biggest companies. The FTC jurisdiction, of course, includes not just this and some pieces of antitrust, but also consumer issues, advertising. So they have a whole reason for being. What concerns me is when some of my colleagues, like my friend Mike Lee, who's been great on a number of issues where he's worked with me, kind of just wants to limit what the FTC can do. I don't think that's going to be helpful at all right now. I think you just need the kind of coordination that you're talking about with each administration if you really want to do your jobs to protect consumers. And the FTC has done some really good things in the past, including the lawsuit I just mentioned.
So I want to start talking about solutions, and you mentioned some of them. You have, and it is sweeping bill, S-225. Do I have that right? I think so. And you talk about a lot of things. And in your book, by the way, unlike some books by elected officials where there's sort of a brief panacea type conclusion, you diagnose the problems and there's not much. You have 25 recommendations.
Yes.
In various categories, including, what Congress can do, which you're a member of, what the president can do, and then what the public can do. Can you talk about, I want to come back to your bill in a moment, but what the president of the United States can do on his own to alleviate some of these problems?
I think the number one thing is putting people in place that have the credibility and the experience to take on these big companies. And he's doing that as we speak. Merrick Garland himself mentioned it when President Biden was standing next to him when he was nominated. And he himself has taught antitrust. He knows it from his work on the DC circuit. I think that is one big beginning, to have an attorney general that's knowledgeable about the issue. And then you have the people he's putting in have pledged to make it also a major priority, including Lisa Monaco. He still hasn't announced the head of DOJ antitrust, but that's very important as well. Then you go to the work they can do. They can do so much as long as they ask for the resources, which Trump never did till the end, and we're able to build these cases. That's where the rubber hits the road. What are they doing with these cases? Are they being tough enough? Are they being smart about the ones they bring on? Instead of, during the Trump administration, sadly, they put a bunch of resources into marijuana and what the California was doing, which was smart about auto admissions, and they tried to act like they were violating the antitrust laws. So analyzing industries, Casper Weinberger used to have the FTC, one was for this, looking at each industry to figure out the consolidation. People stopped doing it because business didn't like it. There are many things they can do. And then you go to the third thing, what individual people can do. And that is, well, in addition to, reading my book, that is getting on board with some of the groups working on this all the time, like Open Markets. And I have a list of the different agencies, nonprofits, where they can actually get on their websites and figure out what's going on. They can ask elected officials about this all the time of both parties. They can write them, but they can also ask them whether they're doing Zoom calls or real person meetings. And then I have the stuff we should be doing. And I make it really clear it's not just about antitrust, because I like to call it competition policy. It is also about everything from patent reform to making sure that we've got minimum wage in place that works for people. This is all about competition and how we're going to get a stronger economy. Immigration policy is so helpful so that we're bringing in new blood. This is all about competition policy for people to work at not just big companies, but little companies as well.
Can you get this into infrastructure?
Yeah, well, I'm actually working to get the Klobuchar-Grassley bill, which we're both working on, into this competition bill that Senator Schumer and Senator Young are doing. And people are very interested in doing that. That would change the fees. It already was passed. It already was okayed through the Senate at the end of the year. So that would be a good start. And we'll see about the infrastructure bill. That's taking a little longer. So.
Yeah. You talk about something that I think is very important and doesn't get a lot of attention in this sphere of workers' rights. Mm-hmm. And maybe people who haven't experienced this personally don't realize there are lots and lots of workers in America who sign what's called a non-compete.
Non-compete.
Which, depending on how it's written, precludes them post-employment for some period of time, sometimes for a pretty onerous period of time, from doing similar kinds of work, whether they're highly compensated or not. Generally believed to be unenforceable. California's passed a particular statute. The trend is away from this, but man, a lot of companies, for at-will employees, make them sign those things, and employees want the job and they don't think ahead and they sign them. What do you think about that?
Well, that is thank you for bringing it up, because that's one of the big examples I use of what competition policy should be. It's one thing to say that you are, an engineer that has all these secrets from a company because of your high position and what you know, and you shouldn't be able to work at a competitor for a few years, or if you're someone that has a really, really high position. It's another to say sandwich workers at Jimmy John's or somewhere aren't able to go get a job. And literally now there have been cases, and there has been a number of them have been one where you can't have low-level employees that are then can't go to another company. It's like you have they're not golden handcuffs, right? They're like, I don't know what you call them. They're
zip ties.
Yeah, exactly. That's good. I guess that's why you're doing
that.
I'm doing my job, and you are good at this. Zip ties. That's what it is. You're stuck where you are. You can't go anywhere. They won't let you. You sign something that you probably didn't even understand. And so that's why federal legislation to limit how those are used is a very smart idea. Because that also, it is, maybe on its face, it sounds good for the economy only because some businesses want it, but overall it's bad for the economy because the economy includes the workers, and the workers should be able to sell their goods, which is themselves, to other companies.
Now, your sweeping legislation, what would it do to counteract or prevent the scenario that we talked about at the beginning? For example, price gouging in pharma, that the Ovation example where they bought both drugs, then multiplied the price by, 1,000,000%. Does your bill address that situation?
Yes. First of all, that would be when those mergers were somehow proposed let's just go unwind it before it even happened. It would have been harder for them to do it in that they would have had to make the case in a stronger way. So depending on the size of a merger and the size of the company doing it, that one, I look at that and I say, either if you're over a $5 billion merger, which that may not have been, right? But if you're a big guy that's purchasing a small company, there's a change in a burden if you are controlling a market. And in this case, they would have been over 50% of a market when they controlled the second one. And it just says the companies have to prove that they don't hurt competition. It might have helped in that way. I would be unwinding to the merger stage, but I'm just showing how it would help if it happened now. The second piece, which is really interesting, and by the way, of course, now their competitors have existed in that market, but then they had, it really is hurt because for 5 years they have the monopoly on the baby heart drug. The second way it really helps is to unwind and to look back exclusionary conduct and what they've done. And then when that went to court, it would have made it a much easier case for the government to bring, because of the way I define what exclusionary conduct is. I actually define it, which includes sort of the price gouging and predatory pricing and things like that. And to basically say, if you can show an appreciable risk of reducing competition, if depending on the size of the company, the government, or the other side, the companies, then you can't go through with the deal. And again, I've gotten some support from people like Mark Warner, who came out of business just because we know that this is getting so out of control.
So let's go to some of the major things that your bill does. And, the insight is, in litigations, in enforcement actions, the standard of proof matters.
Mm-hmm.
What you have to prove. That's almost the most important thing. One of the reasons why criminal cases are very difficult, even in cases where the statute can apply civilly and criminally, it's the different standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In antitrust law, I guess you've taken the position that the standard for blocking a merger is too high. And so you propose lowering it. Explain what you mean by that.
So basically, what I want to show is that it's at an appreciable risk of harming competition, right? Because right now it's it's set at a substantial, the word substantial, and you can go down to things like material risk, appreciable risk, so that you're basically, as you said, lowering the standard so that it makes it easier to prove up that it's a risk. And why am I doing this? Because why did it work okay for the first, decades of the first decade, nothing happened under the Sherman Act. And that's why the Clayton Act came about. But the court cases, Preet, have created, because of the Bork philosophy, their own basically imprint on a law that was meant to be all about competition and doing something about this. And over time, it's just become harder and harder to prove. There was one 15-year case, 15-year time period where the Supreme Court went against the plaintiffs every single time on antitrust cases. So that's why changing the burden so that the companies have to prove that they haven't created this risk, or they won't create this risk with this merger, and then also changing the merger standard itself would be a good thing. And there are Republicans that support at least changing the burden. And I do it on the big companies, 5 billion and up mergers. And then I also do it on major market where they control a big part of the market and they're buying a little guy. That would be the WhatsApp example, Instagram example, right in their area that they're already dominating.
Would you be willing to, and maybe I should know the answer to this question, because maybe there are bills like this, but you have the sweeping legislation that does a lot of different things.
Right.
This is always the question. Would you be prepared to move the more passable parts one by one? Or do you want to hold out for the full? You would.
Yes. For something like For the People, which we have the markup coming up very soon in May, that I think we need to keep together. Something like this, where I have bipartisan support for some, where we've seen I would say right now the public isn't as informed as they should be. I take responsibility for that about these issues. I think what we can get now, given what these monopolies are doing, we should take. And that doesn't mean that's all we take. I think the building block thing works here. We got to get the agencies funded. Then the agencies show that they're actually bringing major cases and getting things done. But then the agencies say, and they gain credibility, then they say, but we can't do anything here because we need a change in laws. Then we take different pieces of the bill. We can't wait on some of these issues like app stores or newspapers who are falling by the wayside every single day because they're not getting paid for their content. So some of this stuff we're going to have to move on its own. And David Cicilline and I have talked extensively about this. And so if we can move big, we're ready to move big. If we can break down the bills, we'll break down the bills. I am just as pragmatic as I can about this, because when you're facing a situation where nothing has happened for decades, and we have the most consolidated economy we've ever seen, and we have trillion-dollar gatekeepers of major pieces of our economy, you better get started somewhere.
Are there particular companies who, like AT&T, are just way too, I mean, maybe you've already, mentioned this, they're just way too big and they need to be broken up? And
Yeah.
will you name them?
Yeah, but you've got to do it under the law. You can't just decree it, right?
No,
So
yes.
yeah.
Right.
So yeah, they're too big to fix, basically, as opposed to too big to fail. And I think we do have that going on with these tech gatekeepers. And it doesn't mean that you get rid of them. I am saying that again. It means you say to Google, no, you can't self-preference your own products over other products. You Google and you Apple, no, you can't charge 30% of the money up when people buy stuff on these app stores like Spotify, which directly compete with your Apple Music. You can't charge that high. You can't not tell consumers that there's cheaper ways, or not allow the people that have the apps on your app store to do that. You can't intimidate witnesses on the eve of a hearing. Companies like Facebook, no, we got to spin off Instagram and WhatsApp and set some really clear rules of the road of what you can do. All of that, just as, Apple itself came up. Some of these companies came up because there were pauses in monopolization in certain areas while they were looking at IBM and other places. Microsoft came up that way. And then it's like this circle. Then they get really big. Then if you don't do anything, they're just going to dominate. Amazon, with the way they dominate that particular area. You've just got to start taking these on, and either by legislation or by agencies to get more competition.
So I think last question, because I think we're running out of time and we have some audience questions that have been submitted. I mentioned to you that I began my career doing some antitrust law. And if you talk to lawyers, they will, I think one of the reasons why it's difficult to penetrate on these issues to the public is that, among the most complicated areas of law, if you're actually practicing and you're trying to get the TRO, prevent the merger, et cetera, private antitrust law is the complexity of it. And I remember early on, law partners would say that, the two most complicated areas of law as a practitioner arguably are antitrust and tax. Did you enjoy practicing it as a lawyer in private practice? Do you agree with that assessment? And is that one of the reasons why it's hard for non-practitioners to understand the issues?
Oh, it's so hard. And I actually wasn't a straight antitrust lawyer. And that's one of the more interesting things about the book. I learned this over years of starting with those games of Monopoly at my best friend Amy Sherbert's cabin, going forward to my work at the law firm, where I actually represented MCI. They were one of my major clients over many, many years. And it's when they were trying to get into the local markets, and those were dominated after the breakup of AT&T. And so I just saw firsthand this argument. I saw how we were always on the sides of the consumers in almost every case that I did with the Attorney General's office and the like. And that's what gave me this understanding. Wait a minute, at a young lawyer, you can be doing actually private practice and be on the side of the consumer and competition. And from there, I learned some when our daughter was born, and they had these insurance rules on you could only stay in the hospital for 24 hours, and I got kicked out. And I thought, wow, I took that on. And then I end up on the Judiciary Committee and the chair or ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee. And that's when that was the most eye-opening part. So I have learned this over time. And I thought, well, why not do this book? Because I'm a little bit like everyone else. I'm not a full-time antitrust lawyer. I've just happened to have these life experiences, including—
and you're not busy at all, running for president, being a senator.
No, but I've had these
subcommittee
experiences. My grandpa
tons of free time.
Right. But, my grandpa working in the iron ore mines to, create the James J. Hill empire with his big house just 15 miles from our somewhat smaller house, or a lot smaller house. And so it just gave me that sense to be able to write the book. And I tried as much. Of course, the policy stuff at the end gets, I had to dig in on that. But I tried to write it in a way that people would find it interesting so that they can help me get this done, because we need help.
Absolutely. And the cartoons, there's cartoons.
Yeah, over 100.
Over 100. Senator Klobuchar, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you for writing this very important book that everyone should read. I found it great, entertaining, and informative. And I'm now going to be an activist alongside you.
Okay.
So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Preet.
I think there's some questions from the audience.
Okay.
Yes,
excellent. I'm ready to take them.
Thank you, Preet. First question is, would you talk about the role of how antitrust legislation in Europe, let's say, impacts what happens in the US and vice versa?
Yeah, great question. So Europe has been taking this on for a while. There's a woman named Margaret Vestager, who's the head of the EU's competition policy. And she and I have done a bunch of things together. And I thought it was interesting when someone like Marsha Blackburn has been talking about this, and she talked about how she spoke at the House of Lords at our hearing the other day. We can't look at this as an isolated matter. Europe has taken this on quite aggressively. They have a different situation. There's some things that are easier for them to do under existing laws, but they've taken on the tech issues in terms of saying, look, you've got to open things up more. You can't exclude other companies. And they've pushed them. And so working with Europe, this goes way back to Janet Reno's time where she started coordinating antitrust with other countries, but we have to coordinate our policies. And that's what she and I are doing, and a lot of others are doing. Australia, I thought that was a great example when it was News Corp, it was Rupert Murdoch, because he had the power to do it, but the newspapers were on his side. They decide, Australia, start looking at how can we make people pay for content. And Google and Facebook said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to leave. I mean, if you ever want a definition of a monopoly, it's two companies that can say, we're going to leave, and you're not going to have a search engine because we're 90% of the game. And so why I bring up the rest of the world is it was widespread anger about that from Europe, from America, from policy leaders, all over the place, that helped to make them back off of that position, Google and Facebook. They didn't leave, and they're negotiating that now. So I think better coordination with Europe, but not just Europe, is going to be a big piece of this. I'm reaching out to the Canadians next week on this. So we're really trying to coordinate this.
Next question comes from a gentleman who says, I'm old enough to remember when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House. Both sides might disagree on something, but I was convinced that at the end of the day, what's good for the American people would be the most important decision members of the Senate and House would decide on. Today, however, it feels like every decision hinges on one winning and one losing. Look, for example, at Senator Hawley practically voting against every bill. How do you make of that change of the climate and tone in Washington?
Well, it's been just so detrimental to the American people, and has made it pretty miserable to try to get things done. We all know that. I do think there's been this sea change this year with President Biden just deciding and having such a keen understanding of the way the Senate works. You're like, okay, you guys want to negotiate, let's look at it. And I think everyone knows he means it. But at some point, I can't wait, he says, and we as Democrats say, we can't wait to get the pandemic relief package through when we're in the middle of an upsurge in cases and we need to get the vaccine money out. We're going to find a procedure, and we did, in reconciliation to get it done. I personally favor abolishing the filibuster. I think that would make things much easier. And I think the time has come to get rid of an archaic procedure. That all said, I'm one of the top people for working across the aisle, and this antitrust area is a great example of that. I think that can still go on. And I actually think the way you rejigger and get back to that is if you show some leverage when you've got the White House and you've got procedures you can use or get rid of, you use that. And then suddenly we've rejiggered to say, okay, man, the people want stuff. Democrats and Republicans want an infrastructure package. They want us to get pandemic relief out there. So why don't you work with us? Because otherwise we're just going to do it on our own. And then some of your priorities won't get in there. That's usually why you do that. You want projects of your own in, so you're willing to negotiate. They have somehow, that has gone away from their calculations, because it's more important to just kind of suck up to whatever the extreme base is. And I am hoping with this sort of change in by disrupting the relationship right now, by using some of the things that we've been doing to get things done, then we'll have true negotiations. And I don't think that's naive, because I believe in it. And antitrust is one of the few areas where we're starting to see incredible bipartisan support for moving forward.
In certain circles, they repeatedly say, in quotes, let the market sort it out. But clearly the market cannot. How do we convince people of that opinion that there is a role for government?
Well, I make the case in this book, one, historically, man, was that happening? I've mentioned Adam Smith, big believer in going after monopolies. And so you make the case historically of how we've done that. Then you make the practical cases. It's not good if small businesses just get beaten up and tossed aside, or maybe they can go on for a while, but once they get a little bigger and the monopolies don't like that, they basically either buy them or get rid of them. In fact, there is another Mark Zuckerberg email that's very famous where he said, "We'd rather buy than compete." That's the very definition of a monopoly. And so I think that you make the capitalist case, which I think I did with Preet, about why this is good for competition. That's why we have the antitrust laws. That's why we should have competition policy. But then you go a step further, which I think we have not effectively made. That is wages. That is what Preet talked about, the non-compete agreements, all of this. It's part of competition policy, and it might make it more sexy because it more directly affects individuals, and that this is part of the whole argument when it comes to making sure that America can compete on the world stage and that it treats people fairly by doing something about competition policy.
Two more questions. One comes from a lady who's from your home state, Minnesota, who says, please share a Walter Mondale moment with us.
Oh, so as I know your listeners are aware of and viewers, is that Walter Mondale died and he was 93, lived an incredible life, but that still doesn't make it sad for people like me who worked for him and really got my start in politics with him. And there are so many people I've seen. I wrote a piece about this for the New York Times, have come out and called me and told me the same story. You know, my first story was when I was intern in his office, and I thought, oh, I'm in college, I'm going to write these glorious policy briefings. And I ended up having to do the furniture inventory. And I had to crawl under every lamp, chair, and desk to write down the serial number. It took weeks and weeks. And that's when I realized two things. And I always tell students this. One, he was scrupulously honest. Nothing was missing. But secondly, always do good in your jobs, even if you think that they're not what you wanted, because that was my first job in Washington, D.C. And this, as senator, was my second. My interactions with him started there. But then when I wanted to run for Senate, he's the one that I called and he said, okay. And he wanted me to run. He said, you need a 30-second speech for the elevator about why you're running. And I go, okay. He said, modern day politics. So I call him like 2 hours later. Here's my speech. He goes, that's not good enough. And in this Norwegian tone, he goes, why don't you try again? Call me back in an hour. This goes on all day until he finally decides it's good enough. So he was just a mentor. And when he lost the presidency, he could have just crawled under his desk and maybe got on a bunch of boards and done nothing else. He took it on his mission in life to help young people to get into politics. And we were fortunate enough in my state to see that firsthand. You know, we went from negotiating the Camp David peace accords with Jimmy Carter to talking to a grocery store clerk who had a question about Mideast peace, and his humbleness allowed him to do it. So my last thing I'd say about it is he's just a model of not just how you act when you're in power, but how you act when you lose power and when you lose a job or you take a turn, which so many people have had during this pandemic. And so it's worth looking at his life through that lens as well.
And our final question comes from a gentleman who says, I've watched this video that has gone viral on YouTube about a speech you gave at a gridiron dinner that Al Franken helped you with. Could you comment about that and what it was like?
Did Al Franken write that? No. Al and I are friends, and he is continuing to do good work. He went through a lot, and he, has come through it. But he is a podcast that I suggest people listen to. But yeah, so our funny thing was I actually was doing these humor dinners before he got to the Senate. And so I was always really careful that I would do this on my own. And so that he wouldn't actually write any of the jokes, which is true. But but every so often I would review jokes with him. And there was one, I'm not sure which dinner this is because I've done all of them, but there's one very amusing story that he writes about in his book where I was talking to Ted Cruz to go over a joke I was making about Ted Cruz. It was my position. Every senator I made a joke about, I told them ahead of time so they weren't surprised. And if it was inaccurate, sort of the base of it, I needed to know. And this joke was something to the effect of, we've been hearing a lot about cruises lately, because it was when Carnival Cruise was having this sewer problem. I said, we've been hearing about bad cruises lately or something like that. And in this town, we don't know if it's Carnival or Ted, right? So Al comes down and says, what are you two talking about? I said, I was trying out the joke I'm going to make about Ted. It was a little better than I just gave it to you, but I don't remember. And then Al goes, well, in 1 second, he goes, oh, I can improve that joke. And he said, in this town, when you hear about a cruise that's full of shit, you don't know if it's Ted or Carnival. So in any case, I don't know if that's what the caller is referring to, but he did give me advice here and then. That advice I did not take. I did not use that joke, but we've remained friends through a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Klobuchar. Thank you, Preet. A great conversation. Again, a reminder, Senator Klobuchar's book is Antitrust: Taking on Monopoly Power from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age. And it is available wherever books are sold.